Hello. Hi. Somebody says hi.
Hi.
Can you see the screen now?
No,
Hello.
Mike.
Okay, let me try one more thing real quick.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. So while we have Mike for figuring out sharing the screen, welcome everyone. Meanwhile, everyone can start if you want, can start sharing your names and the agencies in the chat box to see if your friends are here. And I myself, Nikila, I'm from Kansas RTAP, part of the program from KUTC, and we also have Peyton, who is also from Kansas RTAP. So Peyton, if you don't mind, will you be able to admit the people when they're coming in? Perfect, thank you. I think, Mike, you got it.
Thank you.
No problem. So let's get started. So again, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Kansas RTAP bi-monthly webinar series. And today we have Mike from Transportation Division of Kansas Corporation Commission to give us a compliance update for the Kansas transit providers. I see a pretty good number of transit agencies today on this webinar, and we hope you enjoy this webinar. So before I introduce our speaker today, some general webinar expectations from you all. Please post your name and agency in the chat box to see if your friends are here. And I already see about 10 people. That's awesome. Keep going. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please post them in the chat box, and we will have a Q&A session at the end. And for some reason, if you have any technical difficulties, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll be posting my email address in the chat box in a moment. So finally, today, our webinar speaker, who is Mike Hayme, joined the Commission's Transportation Division in 2000, and in 2001, he was named as the Director of Transportation. Prior to joining the Commission, he worked as a compliance manager for the private transportation company that transported crude oil with over 100 commercial motor vehicles. He currently lives in Topeka with his wife, Kay. They have 3 grown children and 5 grandchildren. And so let's welcome Mike to our RTAP webinar. And the floor is yours, Mike.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Well, just a little bit of background. We haven't been around the state for a couple of years now, but about 8-9 years ago, we went around the state to a lot of the public transit offices and gave presentations on the safety rules and regulations that applied to public transit providers. And I'm talking to the for-hire public transit providers. Specifically, if you're a city or county, you're exempt from the safety regulations. If you're a private entity, you're subject to the safety regulations in the state and when you leave the state. And I'll get into more of those as we get into the presentation. We do have an exception on our economic regulations for public providers that receive FTA grants from our economic regulations. So operating authority you are exempt from, but the safety would be applicable based on the size of vehicles you operate and where you operate them. And like I said, I'll get into those a little bit more details here in just a second. So I wanted to kind of set that up with that. If you're a city, county, government entity, you would be subject to commercial driver's license standards and substance alcohol testing if you're operating vehicles large enough to do so. So with that, I'll get into the presentation. And if you have questions, I believe she explained how to either raise your hand or ask the questions through the presentation, and we'll address them either through or at the end. Our goal is to work with the industry partners, Kansas Highway Patrol, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, to reduce the number of injury and accidents involving commercial motor vehicles. We adopt regulations, we enforce the regulations, and we're here today giving presentations like this one to your group specifically, so that we can help avoid issues like accidents, injury and fatality accidents. The state of Kansas adopts federal regulations through our administrative regulations. So we adopt federal law as state law. And so we'll get into the definitions. And here, a driver means any person who operates any commercial motor vehicle. And we'll get into the different classes here directly. A commercial motor vehicle, what is it? Well, there's several different examples. And one thing too, I'd like to say up front here, I know most of this is centered around public transportation, but I realize a lot of the public transportation providers may have food trucks, box trucks. You may have maintenance vehicles, pickups and trailers that transport lawnmowers, things like that around to different buildings. If they operate in a state, we may have some exceptions for you for the ones that are 26,000 pounds or less, and I'll address those a little bit later on. If you leave the state in those property carrying vehicles, there are no exceptions from safety. So a commercial motor vehicle for property, you would look at a couple different ways to get there. They have to be 10,001 pounds, either by single or combination weight rating. And here's an example of a spec plate. A lot of these, if they're smaller vehicles, you'll see them on the driver's side door, the latch. It'll give a weight rating. A commercial motor vehicle is determined by either by the gross vehicle weight rating, which is a value specified by the manufacturer to a single vehicle, and or the weight. If it's if there is no weight rating, then they would weigh it. If it's over 10,000 pounds, it would be considered a commercial motor vehicle for property purposes. What is commercial motor vehicles continued? They're a vehicle designed to transport more than 15 passengers, including the driver, not for compensation. These would be examples of van pooling, or a vehicle designed to transport more than 8 passengers, including the driver, for compensation. And this is where it would encompass some of the potential vehicles that your businesses may operate. So 9 or more are regulated for safety. And I might throw this out there too. We've got a slide on operating authority here in a little bit, but I wanted to go ahead and make you aware. If you leave the state in any size vehicle, it doesn't have to be more than 8. Any size vehicle for operating authority purposes, for federal operating authority purposes, you'd be required to have federal for-hire authority prior to doing that trip. So I just want to make sure that you're aware of that. And again, the weight rating here, I mentioned that earlier, but I'll go ahead and address it again. The weight rating is determined. The gross vehicle weight rating is the value specified by the manufacturer for a single vehicle, the weight of a single vehicle. The gross combination weight rating is just simply that, weight rating of a combination vehicle, pickup trailer, truck trailer, whatever the scenario may be. And then we get into what is a commercial motor vehicle for commercial driver's license standards. And this is gets into the larger vehicles or that carry more passengers, and is defined there below. You have a gross vehicle weight rating or combination weight rating of at least 26,001 pounds or more, provided that the towed unit is over 10. That would be considered a Class A commercial motor vehicle for driver's license standards. Then you get into the second bullet there. It's your heavy straight trucks, has a gross vehicle rating of 26,001 pounds or more, and the trailer can't be over 10,000, or you get into the Class A definition. And then C, the next third bullet, is designed to transport more than 16 or more passengers, including the driver. And so this is a class here that would fall into, doesn't meet the definition of the first 2 bullets by weight rating, but is designed to transport more than 16 passengers, including the driver. And the last bullet there addresses hazmat, which you're probably not any of you are transporting, but it's any applicable quantities of hazmat will be considered a commercial driver's license standard vehicle. And here are the classes that I just talked about. The Class A is that any combination, as long as the truck and trailer are at least 26,001 pounds or more, and the trailer is over 10, that's a Class A. Class B gets into heavy straight trucks. The vehicle by itself is 26,001 pounds or more, and the trailer is less than 10, if there is one. And C gets into the groups that don't meet the A or B definition, but by either hazmat or by passengers falls into the Class C category, which may encompass some of your different vehicles and drivers. Interstate commerce. I'm assuming that some of you, if not all of you, that are operating for hire leave the state. You're going to be subject to interstate commerce at that point. And interstate commerce is, as you think of it, is leaving Kansas, going into another state. For property purposes, it could be a continuation of an interstate commodity that never leaves the state. We still fall into the interstate category. So this here give you the different scenarios below that I just mentioned. For your purposes, it's probably going to be leaving in and out of the state. What is intrastate commerce? What's basically anything that does not meet the definition of interstate commerce. So for you, it's point-to-point trips in Kansas, carrying your passengers or your property vehicles, whatever that might be. What is a private motor carrier? Private motor carrier is a company or a vehicle that provides transportation of property or passengers and is not for hire. You're simply hauling your own commodities, your own residents to and from a place here in Kansas. What is a public or for hire motor carrier? For hire is a motor carrier that does hold itself out for hire and for compensation. So whether it be property or passengers. As I mentioned at the start of the program, our economic statute 661,109 does have an exception for the public transportation systems pursuant to the U.S. Code 53.7, 10, and 11 from KCC operating authority. So no operating authority required, but subject to safety. And in that last bullet there is what I mentioned earlier as well. For hire public transport providers are required to obtain federal operating authority prior to operating interstate commerce. So I know in the past that KDOT has helped you with some of the funding there to purchase. It's a $300 application fee. And I think that may still be an option, but that'd be something to check with KDOT about if you're contemplating leaving the state and you operate as a for hire public transit provider. Okay, so now we're going to get into more of the details of the state and federal safety regulations and their applicability to what your operations do. A business operating commercial vehicles must have the following files maintained at its principal place of business. If you're required to have drug and alcohol testing files, they would have to be there. Part 382 is where those drug and alcohol testing files and rules come from. Part 383 is a commercial driver's license standard. Part 387 is the insurance requirements, liability limits. Accident files are in 390. Driver qualification files are in 391. Hours of service is part 395. Maintenance 396. And hazmat files get into part 172 through 180. And I do have a link that I'll show you later if we have time for our compliance manual, where we go into a lot more detailed instruction on what's involved, what's required to be in each one of these sections. So this is more of a high level overview of what you would be required to do if you're operating interstate or intrastate as a for hire public transit provider. Substance and alcohol testing. Motor carriers must have controlled substance, drug and alcohol testing program for all drivers that drive CDL class vehicles. And that gets into that larger vehicles that we talked about. More than 16 passengers, including the driver, for most of your purposes. Pre-employment, completed in a receipt negative test, documentation prior to operating a commercial motor vehicle. Tests are also required randomly, 50% controlled substances and 10% alcohol, reasonable suspicion training, post-accident, and return to duty testing. Carrier or a business must maintain semi-annual summaries of testing. And a lot of this you'll work out through the consortium that you belong to if you operate the larger vehicles, 16, including the driver and up. If you operate in interstate commerce and you apply, which if you do, you're going to have a DOT number. You would have to designate interstate commerce when you apply for it, or update it to interstate when you decide to leave the state. By doing that, you'll put yourself, your business, your company into what the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration calls their new insurance safety program. The program implementation date was in December of 2009. FMCSA has identified 16 regulations that are essential elements to basic safety management controls, and I can get into those a little bit later. This means that within 18 months of applying, it's now more like within 12 months. They've kind of ratcheted it down to make sure that people operating interstate commerce, they have an understanding of how your business is going to operate. And so they're out there usually within 12 months of you applying for a DOT number. And really what those 16 regulations or essential elements are, they're common sense rules, not using a positive driver that tested positive, a driver that refused to test, hours of service issues, not having minimum liability in place prior to operating, annual inspections, just to name a few. But there's a lot more involved in that. But if you want to, you can get on the FMCSA website, and that website is simply www.fmcsa.dot.gov. And I think I have that link on the compliance manual that I'll show you after a bit. So if you have applied for an interstate DOT number, you will be getting contacted. In Kansas, the Highway Patrol performs the new insurance audits on behalf of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration here in Kansas. Each state is different as how that happens, who performs the audit. For passengers and property, it is a pass-fail audit, as I mentioned, and they'll give you a call up front. You'll get a letter, and then within 12 months they'll be visiting you and going through that audit with your business. What are the minimum levels of financial responsibility? And this one here is rather unique. Our Kansas minimum liability limits are 100, 300, and 50,000. That is the minimum. Interstate or foreign commerce public liability limits are quite a bit more. You see there, 15 passenger less, it's 1.5 million. For over 15 passengers, it's 5 million. Now, one unique exception that you have under the FTA funded groups is that you're only required to comply with the highest state insurance requirement. So for example, if you operate, I believe Oklahoma is similar to Kansas, at least they used to be. I haven't checked for a few years, so you'd have to check before you operated. If they have the same limits that Kansas has, then you would only be required to have the minimum or whatever it is you have in place to operate in Kansas and Oklahoma. I believe Missouri adopts the federal guidelines for public liability limits. So you're looking at either 1.5 or 5 million, depending on the size of the vehicle operated across state lines. So you do have an exception there. You just have to check in all the states you're going to be operating in to see what that is, or go out and pay the federal limits and to ensure compliance that way. I'm assuming most of you have way more than the minimum limits regardless, but you do have some options there when it comes to minimum financial responsibilities, the liability limits for your business. Next slide. Okay, so we get into some of the general applicability and definitions. Both intrastate and interstate businesses operating commercial vehicles are subject to 390, the general applicability. This gets into DOT numbers, markings of CMVs, action files, just to name a few of the requirements you may be subject to. When you apply for your DOT number, you'll go into the FMCSA, and there's their link right there on this slide here. That's where you would go to that link, click on registration, and just follow their cues to proceed to the next slide to get your DOT number. DOT numbers are free. A couple of years ago, the feds had intended to charge a fee for these. So it'd been $300, but the URS program has not proceeded as timely as they had hoped it would. So at this point, the DOT numbers are still free. But you would make your initial application to get the DOT number at this site. You'll receive a PIN number, and you'll need to keep that PIN number because any update, and you are required to do updates, biannual updates to this number to keep it activated. So this is part of the requirements under 390. This gets into the marketing requirements. These are state law marketing requirements. You're required to have the legal name, US DOT number on both sides of the vehicle. State law requires the markings to be in contrasting colors and visible in daylight within 50 feet. Federal law just has to be legible. So similar, but a little different. But again, marking on both sides, legal name or DBA, followed by the US DOT number. Next slide is, are you subject to the Unified Carrier Registration fees? And this is a interstate registration, the federal registration that applies to anybody that operates in interstate commerce. There are a couple exceptions, but since I'm talking specifically to the for-hire group here, the public transit section, you would be subject to the Unified Carrier Registration or UCR fees if you operate in interstate commerce or have designated your DOT number to be interstate commerce. You're getting notices from us for renewals. If you haven't renewed, you're getting a solicitation from the UCR's National Registration System on a 21-day period. So it doesn't matter that you haven't gone out. If you haven't paid and you get stopped in state or out of state, there are civil fines that will be assessed up to $300 if you haven't paid the registration fees. So UCR does apply to any entity, and this would be on the property side or the for-hire passengers. Now, when it gets into the passengers, private motor carriers of passengers are the only entity that are exempt. So there's two exceptions, wholly intrastate and private motor carriers of passengers. All other entities operating in interstate commerce are subject to the Unified Carrier Registration fees. This year, there's 6 tiers, and you pay based on the number of vehicles that your company is going to use, your business is going to use in interstate commerce. The lowest tier bracket is $59. I think it's going to be $41 next year. We're actually going to have another reduction in fees. So those fees are continue to go down. But then you pay according if it goes up there, up to I think in the 50s, 50,000 if you're in a tier 6. Qualification of drivers. Both intrastate and interstate businesses that operate commercial motor vehicles are subject to Part 391. Drivers must be at least 18 years old in intrastate commerce, 21 years old to operate in interstate commerce. Be able to communicate with the investigating officer if they're stopped at a roadside or a port of entry. Be trained to operate the motor vehicle they're operating. Meet the DOT physical requirements. Maintain a valid driver's license. And this is continued on to you're required to have application for employment, motor vehicle records. You'll run those annually. Inquire to previous employer, medical examiner certificate, road test, annual review of driver's driving record. And I put this information down here at the bottom, and I'll go through the compliance manual here in just a little bit. As I indicated earlier, we have a procedures manual where we provide you all the applications to be able to build your driver files, maintenance files, whatever the case may be, hours of service guidance, substance alcohol testing. We go into a lot more detail in that manual. But here's how you get there. You go to the KCC website. You'll select transportation screen, which you'll have to scroll down just a tad bit to see the transportation. You then click on the safety information screen, and the safety manual's on the right side. I believe it's the second bullet down. The next slide gets into driving of commercial motor vehicles. Part 392 is what I like to call the good sense rule. You can't use a sick or fatigued operator. Alcohol prohibition, I mean, that makes sense. Seatbelt use is, seatbelts are required. If you're operating interstate commerce, you must have operating authority prior to doing that if you're required to do that. Emergency equipment on the vehicle, inspection of cargo if you're hauling property, and so on and so forth. So it gets into all the good sense rules that you are required to follow if you operate in interstate commerce. You get into the parts and accessory for safe operation, necessary for safe operation. This is the all the components that make up a commercial motor vehicle. You get into lighting devices, brakes, coupling devices, emergency equipment, protection against the shifting and falling cargo, load securement, frames, wheels, steerings, and suspension systems. All those must be in good working order before the driver starts that vehicle up and it takes off for their destination, to the best of his ability to determine that. Emergency equipment requirements for commercial vehicles, 3 reflective triangles in case you break down. The driver needs to be able to set those up. 5 mounted 5 BC fire extinguisher or 2 4BC fire extinguishers that are properly filled and accessible, or if you're hauling hazmat, at least a 10 BC. And then the last bullet there gets into spare fuses if the vehicle doesn't have circuit breakers. So you're required to carry those if it is an older vehicle that requires those still. And we get into driver's record of duty status, and this gets into I know in speaking to some of the public transit groups in the past, this was kind of a concern because sometimes your drivers are employees that perform other duties. And so they're working a lot of hours, and that's where you have to kind of watch how you're able to use those drivers. But it gets into, you must be maintained by all drivers. You have to have a driver's record of duty status. When you're operating a commercial motor vehicle on a property side over 10,001 pounds or more, any driver operating a vehicle with a placard quantities hazmat, any driver of a vehicle designed to transport more than 9 passengers for most of your businesses. So 9 or more is the key for higher public transit on the safety side. So property carrier rules are a little different than the passenger. Some of you do operate both. I'm going to touch on both of these. And as I indicated, there's a lot more information on this in our compliance manual. But property carrier rules, they're subject to 11 hours driving in 14 consecutive hours on duty. On-duty breaks do not extend the 14-hour on-duty time. If they're working, they can work 60 and 70 hours on duty, or 7 and 8 consecutive days. So if you're working around the clock, it's going to be 70 hours. If you're working 7 days a week, it's going to be 70 hours in 8 days. If it's less than that every day of the week, it'd be 60 hours in 7 days. Passenger carrier rules, driving, you have 10 hours driving time, 15 hours on duty. Breaks may extend the time on duty. And you have to have 8 cumulative hours off duty to restart the day. Again, 60 or 70 hours on duty and 7 8 consecutive days. And this is continued on. A passenger motor carrier cannot allow or require any driver to drive more than 10 hours following 8 consecutive hours off duty, or after being on duty for 15 hours following 8 consecutive hours. A passenger motor carrier operating commercial motor vehicles every day of the week, they shall not allow or require driver to drive after being on duty more than 70 hours in any 8 consecutive days. A passenger motor carrier operating less than every day of the week, gets into what I talked about on the air screen, shall not allow a driver to drive after being on duty more than 60 hours in 7 consecutive days. It just depends on how your business is set up. If you're 7 days a week, like many public transit providers are, then you'll fall into either one of these categories. And again, off-duty time may extend the on-duty time. Short haul operations, and this may be a really easier way for you to calculate your driver's hours of duty service. You don't have to have a logbook like we perceive most of the over-the-road or property carrying businesses. You can keep time records, and time records are simply, you document the driver, what time the driver starts, what time the driver is relieved of duty, and you total the hours. So a driver's passenger carrying vehicles who operate within a 150 air mile radius of their normal work reporting location are not required to keep a logbook, but must maintain time records. Drivers may drive up to 10 hours after coming on duty, following 8 or more consecutive hours off duty. The driver returns to the work fulfilling location and is released from work within 14 consecutive hours. And in place of the record of duty status, the motor carrier must maintain and retain true and accurate time records for a period of 6 months. This is per driver with all the supporting documentation. So if you have a driver that works as a CNA part-time and drives part-time, these time records are simply there to you don't document driving time or you don't split out the time. It's any time. So if they're working 12-hour shifts every day of the week, you're going to have to watch the drivers that are also working in other parts of your business. Just make sure that they have time to drive before you put them in a vehicle to head out on a trip. Okay, so the retention requirements extended here for logbooks made duplicate for 24-hour period, original maintained by the motor carrier at its place of business. You keep it in file 6 months by driver, by month, with supporting documents, as I mentioned earlier. The record of duty status will be in the driver's handwriting and submitted to the motor carrier within 13 days if you have satellite offices. Recap is recommended but not required to prevent hours of service. That's going to get more into the logbooks. So if you have specific questions on that, I'd recommend you go to one of our regular safety and education seminars. They get into all the details on logbooks because it does get a little confusing, and they'll break it down to where you can understand it. And they're very interactive classes. If you just want a general safety refresher, I highly recommend that. That'll be the first bullet on that safety screen that's right before the compliance manual that I mentioned earlier. Here's an example of a time record. Again, the driver has a 150 air mile radius, so it's a long 172.6 miles as a crow flies around their starting point or their work. They have to be relieved from work within 14 hours. So, and you're not documenting, this is not just for driving time. This is any compensated time they're working for you. So if they wear multiple hats and perform different duties for you, you start just like a time clock. If you're punching a time clock and you get this information and you keep it for 6 months for the drivers, then you're in compliance. The key is just making sure they have time to drive before you send them out on a road trip. We'll get into the maintenance files. They must be maintained on each commercial motor vehicle, all buses, trucks, truck tractors, whatever it is that you operate that are subject to the safety regulations. Again, for the passengers, it's more than 8, so 9 and up. Property is 10,001 pounds or more. The records must contain make, year, serial number, VIN number, tire size, and company number. These pages here are in our compliance manual, 27 and 28. Provide you documents to use if you're, so you don't have to generate something, or you can generate your own depending on how you set up your business. Included in maintenance file, date and mileage of oil change and lubrication, dates description of all preventative services and repairs, any inspection and preventive maintenance schedules. Develop your own or use suggested schedule from the manufacturer. Make sure all annual inspections are current. Annual inspections are required before a vehicle is placed in service. And I'm assuming KDOT still performs most of your annual inspections. So you're getting that from them. You do need to maintain copies of the whoever does the inspection certification. So when you get your copies of the annual inspections, make sure you get a copy of his certification to validate your annuals for the vehicles, and you keep that in your files as well. Again, this talks about what I just mentioned, including in the maintenance file, inspector certification for annual inspections. There's a copy of the requirements on page 25 of our compliance manual. There's copies of brake adjuster certification for all company employees who adjust and maintain brakes. Probably not something that happens a lot for your vehicles, sets of vehicles you use. And then records retention. The records required by this section shall be retained where the vehicle is either housed or maintained for a period of 1 year and for 6 months after the vehicle leaves the motor carrier's control or the business control. So here's your retention requirement standard. Pre and post trips. Pre-trips are not required to be documented, although I would recommend that your driver document those. If he's using a logbook, just jot down that he's taking time to do the pre-trip. But pre-trip is where the driver will walk around, check tires, lights, obvious things that may not be in compliance before the vehicle starts out. You review the post-trip report from the prior day to make sure there are no violations documented on that post-trip. If there were, they need to be corrected prior to that vehicle being dispatched out. Again, it's a walk-around inspection for the pre-trip. You sign the post-trip inspection only if defects were found and corrected, or if there were no defects noted before on the previous day. So pretty straightforward stuff. Just make sure that they are doing a quick walk around to save you a potential violation. Lights and tires are, especially lights out, are a good way to get inspected and potentially avoid civil fines. So keys to success. Obviously, it's if you're watching this video, this Zoom meeting, you're here because you're interested in compliance that may apply to you. Communicate with your regulatory offices. When I was with the private company, prior to joining the state, I was always visiting with the people that regulate you. Maintain that relationship. If you're working with them, you're gonna have very few surprises or issues. So visit with us, KHP, FMCSA. Both offices are here in Topeka. All three offices are in Topeka. KCC, KHP, and FMCSA are here in town. The KCC and FMCSA offices are right here on the west side, and the KHP office is downtown. Train your employees about the regulations. Have staff meetings. Talk to them about things. Ask them if there are areas that they have close calls on regularly, so that you can educate new drivers into the system so that they can watch out for close calls, things like that. And always ask questions if you don't understand the rules. Comply with the regulations. Those rules are out there because people have been in accidents and people have died. That's what regulations are developed. The KCC Transportation Division, we're committed to working with you, our industry partners, to enhance your understanding and compliance with the safety rules. We want you to be successful. So before I go into the compliance manual, do we have any questions from anybody? I don't see anything on my screen, but I may not be seeing everything. Can anybody confirm or?
Yes, even I do not have any questions or in the chat box. If you have any questions, like which is long enough to type, you can unmute yourself and ask the question to Mike.
Okay, let me try to get into my other screen real quick. So I'm gonna, so can everybody see this slide here now?
It's the same slide, Mike.
Oh, so I didn't get it. Okay.
Yeah. But we do have one question right now. If you want to answer now or later.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So the question is, can you please go over the public transportation exemptions again?
Be more than happy to. So the public transportation, I'll deal with the for-hire first, and we'll get into the rest. The economic side applies to any type of public transit provider for the state of Kansas. So when I'm talking about economic exceptions, we're talking operating authority. If you're a public transit provider, you are not required to have intrastate authority from the commission. So you're exempt from that. On the federal side, there really aren't any exceptions from safety or economics. On the for-hire side, you kind of fall into wherever whatever type of vehicle you're operating. Now on the insurance, we did talk about that a little bit ago, and you have a unique scenario for the public transit providers because you're only required to maintain the highest amount within the states you operate in. So as I said earlier, if you operate into Oklahoma, I believe they're similar to Kansas. I think Oklahoma, Colorado, and Nebraska this has been 4 or 5 years ago when I checked, were similar to the state of Kansas, where it gets into that 50, 100, 300,000 for liability limits. I'm assuming you all have more than that. But if you go to Missouri, they do adopt the federal insurance requirements. So 15 passengers or less is 1.5 million, 16 or more is 5 million. So you just need to check prior to operating in the states if you're going to be going through a number of states, or just comply with the federal liability limits, that 1.5 or 5 million, to ensure that you are complying. So I think those are most of the exceptions. Private motor carriers of property, I didn't touch on that very much. So a couple of years ago, the state of Kansas took advantage of a federal variance for private carriers. I know some of you have vehicles that you, as I mentioned, you either take care of lawn care or maintenance vehicles that might meet the definition of a commercial vehicle. And I'm talking about vehicles that are tagged in Kansas and do not leave the state of Kansas at this point. So these are strictly intrastate, an intrastate exception. So for those property carrying vehicles, if you have any out there, 10,001 to 26,000 pounds weight rating, they are exempt from all the safety on the private side. The only thing they'd be subject to would be liability limit, not liability, the cargo securement, coupling devices. The coupling devices have to be in good working condition. That's really what it boils down to. Cargo securement gets into whatever they're transporting has to be secured to the load, straps, chains, whatever it may be, so that nothing falls off the vehicle. And then annual inspections on truck and or trailer if it's a combination vehicle. So 3 rules apply to the property side, property carrying vehicles, 10.1 to 26,000 pounds that do not leave the state. Annual inspections, car securement, and coupling devices. So those are the exceptions that apply to the property side of the public transit. And then, like I said, the main one for the economics for any public transit provider is the state authority, the intrastate authority. You're exempt from those. So that is those are the main exceptions really. On the safety side, it gets back into you're really subject to safety based on the size of vehicles you operate. City and counties, again, you have exceptions from all the safety. The government entities are not required safety. The only thing that government entities are required to do would be commercial driver's license. You got to comply with all the commercial driver's license standards. And if you're operating a commercial driver's license class vehicle, CDL class vehicle, then subcycle testing will apply to the drivers. So I think that is really the exceptions as I know them. And that link that I talked about, I'm not able to pull it up, but I did share it through the book. One thing I will talk about on our let me see. Can you see this at all? Are you still looking at the PowerPoint?
We are still looking at the PowerPoint.
Okay, let me try to get out of that real quick.
And we do have one more question.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes. What if you drive someone to Kansas City and you cross the state line into Missouri? Do you have to do interstate licensed? Some roads lead through both the states.
Okay, well, that's a great question. What depends on what size vehicle they're going to operate. So if they're operating as a for-hire entity, as I mentioned early on in the program, safety applies to vehicles based on the size that they're operating, 9 to 15, and 16 or more. Operating authority would apply, federal operating authority for that scenario that you just gave me would apply to any size vehicle. So if you're operating in a minivan, a 7-passenger minivan, and you're taking a client to Kansas City to a doctor's appointment or whatever the case may be, that would be where the federal authority would apply. Now we do have a unique exception for the businesses that are operating in the Kansas City, Kansas, Kansas City, Missouri commercial zone. If you're operating wholly within that commercial zone, and there is a map of the commercial zone, it's like the fourth bullet on that same link where I've mentioned where the classes in our manual are located. If you're a business that operates in the Kansas City, Kansas area, Kansas City, Missouri area, you can look at that map and you would be exempt from the federal authority if that's all that you operate in. You never leave that exempt zone. But if for any other businesses that operate in and out of state, any size vehicle will be required, as a for-hire would be required federal authority. And then the safety applies based on the size of vehicle being operated. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, if you have a large group and you have quite a few drivers and you'd like specific training or just a refresher to fit your specific needs, please email me. I can give you my email, or Nicola, you can share that if you'd like. I'd be more happy to set up a presentation, or if we can get several groups together. We're always looking to educate our industry partners. So like I said earlier, we really want you to be successful. If you're successful, we're successful. And the state of Kansas, unfortunately, right now is experiencing a lot, too many commercial motor vehicles are involved in injury and fatality accidents across the nation. You need to be in compliance with the rules that apply to your vehicles and your business, because there's so many distracted drivers out there right now. It may not be your fault, but if you're involved in an accident and you're not in compliance, they're gonna use the fact that you're not in compliance, that you probably shouldn't have been at that location, and potentially make that accident your fault, whether it was or not. So we've seen that happening across the country. And some of these lawsuits are just off the charts when it comes to they shut down a lot of businesses based on accidents and not being in compliance. So we'd be more than happy to help you craft a program that would meet your needs. So please reach out to me if you have questions. And I really appreciate the opportunity. We may start another campaign to go around the state again if we have enough interest to educate the public transit, just to give a refresher if you think that'd be beneficial at some point.
So I just shared the email address of Mike in the chat box. And Mike, I did share a link. Is that the manual that you're looking for?
I don't see the link.
Oh, you don't?
I don't know why it's not letting me pull this up here. Let me try something else real quick. And you can't see what I'm saying?
No.
Okay. Well, if you want to, I'm not sure how much time we have. We got a little bit of time left. If you want to open that link, I'm just not able to see it at this point. So
Okay.
if you could get it to share with me, that would be great.
Okay. Do you want me to share my screen though? Like,
Yeah.
Okay.
If you want to click on that link, then I'll walk you through some of the highlights of the manual real quick. Or if you just get to that safety screen, I'll talk to you about what's out there.
Is this the one that we are looking for?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, no problem.
So the manual itself, if you scroll down just a little bit, all the contents are here and shows you the page numbers for that. But if you'll scroll down just a couple pages. One more page, please. Yeah, right here. If you go back up just to the next one real quick.
This
So
one?
here we have all the links to apply for a DOT number and for different types of questions, depending on what you're looking for. So there's a lot of links out there, a lot of resources on this page. So now if you'll go to page 4 of the document. One more page. It'd be the actual manual page, not the screen. But
Oh.
okay, checklist right there. You're right there. Okay, so scroll up just a little bit. Okay, so here is the information I was talking about when I mentioned the driver files. Here are all the documents available. It shows you the page numbers to go out and build your own driver files, depending on what size vehicle your drivers are operating. But here's a complete checklist, and it gets sent into, as you scroll down, drug substance and alcohol testing requirements, hours of service, emergency equipment, maintenance files, and it shows you what pages in the document those that information is based on. So there's just a lot of information out there in this manual. And if you could get back at just to where that link was, where the state shows the safety slide, it shows the safety picture, I mean the box. So just get out of the manual.
Oh, to the menu?
If you can just go back to where, before you got to the manual. If you could do that. If not, it's not a big deal. But this manual is really developed so that you didn't, we tried to eliminate the need for people to require consultants. I mean, consulting gets expensive, but it's a great way to, if you're a large company and you don't have the resources, consulting may be the way to go. But we developed this manual so that you could build your program and maintain your program yourself rather easily. So can you hit the back arrow? Probably not.
Yeah, I mean, this is the link that you shared with me. So
yeah, I just sent that. But so the same place on that, when I showed you that one screen here that showed the KCC website, how to get there, this is the second bullet. The first bullet is actually the classes that get in. These are the comprehensive classes that really go through all the detail of a compliance program. There are other links out there of our administrative regulations that we've adopted federal law. And we also have the map out there on this safety screen that you can't see here, but it does provide you with the commercial zone. So like I mentioned, for the businesses that may operate in Kansas City, Kansas, Kansas City, Missouri commercial zone, they are exempt from the federal authority. And it's a small zone, but it is out there, and it is an option if that's something that would benefit you. So I think that's most of the information that I had prepared today. Again, I really appreciate the opportunity, and you know, if you think of anything that we didn't touch on today or any more specifics, email me. I'll be more than happy to visit with you.
that's awesome, Mike. Thank you so much. This was a great presentation. I hope it was pretty useful to all the attendees here. So we appreciate your time, and a very big thank you for all the attendees. We hope you enjoyed this webinar, and if you have any questions later, as Mike said, please feel free to contact him. I did post the email address in the chat box, and I also posted the link that of the manual that we just went through. So we did record this webinar for your future reference, and will be posted on our YouTube channel soon, where you can also find our past webinar recordings. And until then, see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.